Content warning. Check the show notes for more information. It's April 13th, 1953, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Amid deep Cold War paranoia, the CIA began experimenting with mind control techniques today in history in 1953, hoping to stay ahead in the psychological arms race. But the launch of the agency's MKUltra program, as it was called, soon devolved into extreme drug-taking and voyeuristic sex parties, which you could say expanded their minds, just maybe not in the way they originally intended.
Yeah, this was 1953, so we're definitely at the height of sort of the McCarthy era, but also specifically this is the tail end of the Korean War, and the US military was very disturbed by what was happening or seeming to happen to American prisoners of war in Korea, some of whom were making false confessions, were making accusations about the US, and seemed to be sort of parroting communist talking points. And there was a lot of fear that they had been brainwashed, a word that had been coined only 3 years earlier. It was a translation from a Mandarin expression used in an article about communist China by a journalist called Edward Hunter, and it would later transpire that this was sort of an overblown panic. Most of the prisoners of war in question had been tortured the good old-fashioned way. You know, they had been threatened into making those comments. There were actually a handful of defectors to North Korea from the Korean War, but only a few of them had truly converted to the communist cause. But it did speak to this profound fear that Americans had about communism, namely that it created mindless zombies. And so the American military was like, we need to do that, but better.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of got twin inspirations, really, this, hasn't it? One is, as you say, what's going on in the Korean War, the fear that the Soviets had mind control techniques for interrogation, which they didn't. But also, it grew out of Operation Paperclip, the CIA program we've talked about before, that recruited and provided safe haven to former Nazi scientists at the tail end of the Second World War to help America win that using German technology. And Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA who commissioned MKUltra, called this stage of those two things converging brain warfare. And this has been declassified since. You see him use this phrase numerous times. It's like the Soviets are really clever at this stuff. We have got the best scientists. We need to beat them. And the next frontier, the next thing must be LSD. And it's like, what? Yeah. Where did you get that? Right. But I suppose, the 60s is coming, you're just being prescient.
Yeah, the whole business was led by a chemist and poison specialist called Sidney Gottlieb. And he began experimenting actually not just with LSD, but also with MDMA, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, methamphetamine, and magic mushrooms. So people were getting a whole dose of stuff. And they actually funded research at Columbia University in Stanford. And sometimes, or in fact quite often, unwitting subjects would be signed up and subjected to all these kinds of tests. And they had a few things in mind that these drugs could do. They wanted to create truth serums so that people spoke and revealed things that they didn't want to tell you. They wanted to be able to erase and rewrite memories. Then they wanted to be able to turn people into programmed agents, like the sort of Manchurian candidate where you can have this sort of sleeper person who you can then bring to life in, whatever moment that you need them to do the job that you need them to do. And then they also wanted to be able to induce confusion or mental breakdown in enemies. And they thought that they'd be able to, slip these drugs to rival leaders. Like they had this plot to give LSD to Fidel Castro, which they just thought actually would undermine his credibility. And they wouldn't have been wrong about that one. If suddenly Fidel Castro was appearing publicly on LSD, you'd imagine it would be hard for him to make decisions.
Yeah, and this had been a concern for some time. MKUltra was the successor to a previous CIA program called Project Artichoke, which is a bit less sinister sounding, which launched in 1951. And that program's purpose was summed up in a memo which asked, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation? So really it was all pointing at this idea of creating these programmed assassins. But it just went down so many different rabbit holes over the course. MKUltra was in operation for 20 years. And by the end of it, there had been about 150 known research projects carried out. A lot of the documentation was destroyed when they realized that it was going to be made public by the church committee.
And they wanted to destroy all of it. It was a mistake that we got to see any of it.
Yeah, so the central pillars were brainwashing and LSD, often combined in various ways in the hopes of developing a perfect formula for mind control. But by the 60s, you might be listening to this thinking, but wait, LSD doesn't do any of those things. That is true, and they did not realize this for some time. LSD was a novel synthetic drug, and they weren't sure how far it could go. By the 60s, it was obvious LSD was never going to do what the CIA wanted it to. So beyond that, they were already experimenting with things like sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, psychological torture, and also ways to incapacitate America's enemies with biological or chemical weapons.
But I think it's worth just underlining who the subjects were here. The Soviets weren't doing this, as it turned out, but if they had been, and I do believe that the people in the CIA sincerely thought they were, at least, if you like, they would have been doing it on prisoners of war. But what the Americans were doing was doing it on some people who had volunteered for programs at universities, although the universities themselves and the hospitals and the prisons and the pharmaceutical companies that were involved in this research didn't know that they were part of this sinister program and didn't know that they were ultimately reporting to the CIA. But at least there were volunteers. Some of them were just drug addicts who were bribed with more drugs if they participated. And they were sex workers and they were prisoners. And you are talking about institutionalized torture, and the irony is so clear, isn't it, that in this effort to try and combat the horrors of Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia, you actually get something in its blueprint.
Yeah, and CIA agents and military personnel were also used, both voluntarily and also without their consent. There's been a lot written about how basically being spiked with LSD was an occupational hazard of working at the CIA during this time. People would be sprinkling it in your coffee, and that was just something that might happen if you went to work and didn't keep a very close eye on all of your beverages.
Which, by the way, did result in people, having serious anxiety, incontinence, amnesia.
Yeah, and this had started off during the Project Artichoke days, where they had begun this idea of dosing unsuspecting agents with LSD. One of them was dosed for 77 days straight, and of course they were terrified because they had no idea what was happening to them. By the time of MKUltra, people were a little bit more savvy to the risk that their supervisors might be drugging them without their consent. The most infamous incident was in November 1953. A US biological warfare scientist called Frank Olson was spiked with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb himself, the manager of the program. He started showing signs of psychiatric distress pretty much immediately. And 9 days later, having resigned from his job, he'd worried his wife so much that she had said that he'd promised to seek psychiatric help. Instead, 9 days later, he threw himself to his death from a hotel window. And reportedly, the window was closed. Like, he threw himself through a closed glass window and was killed. And none of this would be revealed until those 1975 hearings.
Yeah, it's funny, like, even when you read the obituaries of the suits, they're very much people that have had a drug-influenced existence, I think. This is a paragraph that jumped out to me from Sidney Gottlieb's obituary in the New York Times. After he left the CIA, Mr. Gottlieb and his wife went to India, where he ran a leper hospital for 18 months. A lifelong stutterer, he pursued a master's degree in speech therapy. He bought land with an old log cabin outside a small Virginia town, Boston, where he practiced two of his lifelong hobbies, folk dancing and herding goats.
This is a man who once suggested assassinating Castro with a poisoned wetsuit.
Yes.
And then
this is the man they called the Black Sorcerer.
Yeah, it's incredible. But to be fair, he obviously didn't reform that much, because when he was interviewed by the church committee, he basically said, MKUltra, I don't really remember. Couldn't tell you anything about it.
And no one actually faced any repercussions legally, did they? There were all these government reviews. 2 lawsuits related to the program reached the Supreme Court in the 1980s. In the end, the Supreme Court protected the CIA over the citizens that had been abused by it.
Well, all of that LSD taking had successfully rewritten or erased their memories, so job done.
Now,
this episode first aired last year exclusively to members of CLUB RETROSPECTORS.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/retrospectors